Well, thank you very much to all presenters, Andrew, Patty, Chris, and Stephen, for the insight into registries and registry randomized trials. And we now can move on to the questions that were submitted during today's presentations. I would just like to, we haven't received many questions, so I would just like to remind that you can still submit questions for everybody through the questions and chat. I suppose, where should we start? In fact, the couple of questions that we have is for Andrew, but I thought that if we begin with the data issues and the registry and the quality, it may link better into the statistical aspects, clearly statistical aspects of the problem that we're trying to look at. Chris raised a very important question, whether we should just accept the registry data. And listening to Chris and to Stephen, I thought that you're describing slightly different problems, and I couldn't help but think that perhaps some of it is linked to the size of the registries that you have, because cardiovascular disease is very, very common. The renal dialysis is not so much. Perhaps some of the concerns that Chris has is about should we accept registry as such is also linked with the fact that this is such a much more enormous size of the whole registry. Chris, what would you, first to you, and then we'll see what Stephen thinks.
Thanks, Dorota. Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. I guess one of the things for our registries is, and cardiovascular events, is they often, often may not occur within the context of a hospital environment. Somebody may have their MI out in the community and may eventually may not end up in a hospital, etc. I think there is an issue of volume, but I think there's also an issue of, the ability to capture these events accurately in a particular environment. In some ways, surgery should be pretty good because it's in a surgical unit. ICUs are probably the best, Andrew. You might agree with that. The whole outcomes and endpoints are within a pretty much a confined period. It may tend itself really nicely for that. And Stevens may also, in the context of a renal dialysis centre, may be not easier, but may be more readily available. So I think your point, Dorota, is correct. The volume and also where these events may actually occur and how we can ensure we've got good information about what type of event actually happened.
Yes, and Stephen, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think what you're hearing and what we'll build over, what we are building already and what we'll build over the next few years is some experience about, if you like, fitting the right horse to the right course, because some types of trials, some outcomes will work very well in a registry-based setting, and there are differences, as Chris has outlined, between different registry-based settings, and other outcomes will be problematic. And I think that there'll be a number of conversations around that. In terms of the dialysis and the kidney transplant cohort, it's a relatively closed system, by which I mean if you're on dialysis, you either remain on dialysis or you're transplanted or you die, and regardless of those outcomes, your care is still provided by nephrology units, and so we have the ability to have that ongoing follow-up. And at critical key points, there is the opportunity to validate outcomes with other data collections, if you like. So for kidney transplantation, you can't have a kidney transplant without having cross-matching and tissue typing. So there's a data feed there that we can validate. And as I mentioned previously, wouldn't have entered somebody's transplant until we had that data. And similarly for mortality, the challenge for registries, and I talked a little bit about patient-reported outcomes, is extending data to stuff that is not able to be quickly and easily ascertained by somebody working clinically, but actually requires more patient involvement. And I think there are models of how we do that. We're trying to get patients engaged in the longer term. I think that's going to be critically important for some registries. The Joint Replacement Registry, I know, are also investigating this, because at the moment, as the outcome of their hip replacement, for example, they investigate whether you die or whether you need another hip replacement, whereas in fact the reason you do hip replacements is to improve mobility and reduce pain. So that for a number of registries, that is going to be a challenge. And I think once you've got that embedded, then that will then stimulate a series of trials that are actually targeted at improving those outcomes.
So essentially what you're saying is everything is context dependent, and we have to look at every issue on its own merit and in its own context.
So this might lead us on to a question which I think Chris ended his presentation with, was alluding to the thought of a world where electronic medical records and administrative data are all much more aligned or easier to link and bring together. Would perhaps, Chris, you might want to start, but I'm happy for others to jump in about thinking about a future where maybe the registries are actually based around just enormously widely linked electronic medical records.
Yeah, look, it's tempting, isn't it? It's you kind of see that as, wouldn't that be wonderful? I guess there's probably two comments. The first one is that currently often that information is derived for a variety of reasons. Some are actually budget related, costing related. Some are obviously related to clinical care. What we've seen, certainly for risk, so for example, to try to benchmark across, the quality of care, for example, in the absence of, really important clinical information, which may not be and often is not part of current routinely collected data, where we actually don't have the information to adequately adjust for risk adjusting for clinical outcomes, for example. Maybe if the EMRs get better, and they're getting better, day by day, in reality they're improving, that information may well be available through routinely collected data. I'm sure everybody could think of examples, but even currently, our hospital systems are very disparate across the different states. Some still work on paper-based records. Some have fully digitized and fully EMR'd. So I think we're incrementally moving to a point where we're coming together. I'm just not sure where or when it will be. But what is important is that as we're going there, we should be making sure that what is in the EMR can answer some of those important clinical questions, so the data could be used, in a registry-based environment. I'd love to see us get to that point. It's the work that Paddy's doing. Think of general practice records, etc. That sort of work. It has got such potential. Still a bit of a way to go, and I'd be interested in your comments on that as well.
Paddy, what
would you like?
Your view of the future? Oh, you might need to come off mute, Paddy.
Okay, sorry. Yes, that's right. There's a lot of work being done in the EMRs collected from general practices. There's for instance, in our own department, we've got the patron data set, and there's also much wider than that. One of the links that I gave on one of the slides talks about the data assets that's being built. And part of it is also standardizing the way the data is collected from EMR, so then you can combine the different data sets being collected across primary care, but at different groups as well. But there is still a lot of work to be, so it's quite useful in some ways, but there's still a lot of work. For instance, there's still a fair amount of free text that needs to be coded before you can use it for analysis. So there's that kind of process where we're trying to standardize and code. There's the SNOMED codes that are being developed so that you can code a lot of the records so that it's a lot more consistent. I'm a little bit, so I'm the one who gets to use the data, but there's a lot of work happening at the higher scale with computer scientists, informaticians, natural processing language that can also be used to then, unify and also make the data a lot more accessible and easy to use. So I think it is a watch this space, and I think eventually we might have a data set that we can then combine, that we can then use in the future.
Well, what you're saying is that there are informaticians and computer science looking into decomposing the data may actually offer some of the solutions, because in my experience as a biostatistician, what I often see, and this is what Stephen now mentioned, that often data is collected at the clinical level, not at the research. So quite often, if you have definitions that change over time, and you've only collected, for example, chronic lung disease, as you've mentioned, as Stephen mentioned, then what happens that you don't have information because all the constituents that provided the diagnosis were lost. So you only have one definition, whereas in fact, if we would be, and we often tend to do it in our studies, to collect individual components of a diagnosis, then should the definitions change, you actually can go back and recreate the outcome according to a current criteria as opposed to a previous one. I'm not trying to say that this is easily done and it can always be done, but these are the things that I was mentioning, and generally that actually benefits from interdisciplinary conversation, like people in informatics. Yep. Stephen?
I think electronic medical records and registries, this discussion sort of has been going on for a while. And look, in the far future, and it's decades away, it may well be that the need for registries is less than it is at the moment. I think there will be an interim phase where there's like data flowing in. For me, though, you mentioned definitions, and one of the great challenges of electronic medical records is there are very few standardized definitions across the hospital system, let alone across the country. One person's diagnosis is totally different to something else. The idea that you're able to refine diagnosis by pulling in other information assumes that other information is in the system. The other cautionary note I take is that one of the reasons clinical quality registries or registries in general are so useful is that they are designed for a purpose, and that purpose is reasonably closely aligned to the issues around running a trial. Electronic medical records are not designed fundamentally to facilitate research, certainly not running a randomized control trial or running a registry. They are designed to help manage patients, or in fact, I'm a little skeptical, and the ones that I've been involved in are actually designed not to make my life easier, but to make administrators' life easier to capture activity data for funding type reasons. And so, and those, though that balance of incentives is not going to change anytime soon. And so my worry is, what I see locally is that in our hospital medical records and the others I've seen, there's a lot of free text, but very little coding. And so to extract whether somebody has diabetes or not, you've actually got to have various crawlers that go and pull out free text if you're going to do all of that. And that's got a long, long way to run that database, that approach.
Yeah. Could I just, some of the trials we are running in primary care is not looking specifically at outcomes of patients, but sometimes process measures. So for instance, the number of types of consultations I might be doing, or reducing the number of certain prescriptions. But there are challenges in that as well, for the same reasons that you've mentioned, that the data is collected for the purposes of the consultation and administrative purposes. But I think over time, the quality can be improved, and also adding extra processes to collect extra data that you may need in the future.
Shall we move on
So-
to a couple of the questions that have come in?
Yep.
So we've got one here, which is, do Stephen or other panel members have any thoughts on the role of registries in evaluating unexpected or adverse events data of multi-site trials in the post-COVID world? Who wants to take that one?
My view is that registries are probably not a great setting to run a trial of a novel interventional agent, and my experience has been with agents, best fluids of use of plasmolite or Hartmann's, or changing the dialysate setting. So these are not investigational agents. They're issues with well documented, if you like, safety records around them. And I think the infrastructure around registries is poorly suited towards recording SAEs. Would be my view. You could, and this is why we've taken the approach of, if you like, building a separate infrastructure where it's needed, rather than investing in changing our core infrastructure for needs that are going to differ from trial to trial.
Okay. I'm just trying. I have another question. I'm just trying to find it in the. But while I'm looking, the question that we have received before was actually a question directed to Andrew from Madeleine Enright. Great talk, Andrew. With protocol compliance and issue in peptic, have you looked at mechanisms to improve this in future trials? What role might clinicians or CTNs have?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, thanks, Madeleine. The issue in peptic, actually, there were some sites who did routinely collect the individual patient level adherence data, but other sites don't collect it at all. So it was very difficult to do that, and I'm not sure how trial networks would be able to assist in that regard. It's really a local resourcing question for the specific sites. That the lesson from peptic, that there were some secondary endpoints that had to be sort of bespoke data collection within each site, that in hindsight we should have made much greater efforts for collecting the adherence data as well.
And
yeah, so I don't really know in terms of the trial networks. I'm not really sure that how they would play a better role.
And regarding the trial, you've mentioned in your talk that you got lucky because the good cross correlation was in your favor. Did you actually have an inkling of that before the study commenced, or this just turned out during the study?
Yeah, no, it just turned out during the study. We'd been doing these calculations for a number of years in sort of various other statistical research studies, or sort of planning this peptic trial, which, you know, the idea for it first came in about 2013. So it was quite a long evolution, and we were consistently getting with the Australia and New Zealand patient database that this sort of 70% to 80%, the good versus the bad. In the actual trial, the reasons that I have that why it may have been lucky in some sense is that we were very careful with the randomization. So we randomized in batches of between 4 to 8 ICUs within the same region, and all had to start at exactly the same time, so we had sort of control for time specific trends within regions, that we didn't have that level of control with Australia and New Zealand. We were just with that with the figures that we got, this sort of 71% good versus bad in the sample size planning. That was just looking at ICUs over a 2 6-month periods, but not really looking at any specific regional aspects of ICUs. Had we controlled for regional aspects, that we may have been able to reduce that. It is also possible that from the time that the sample size calculations were done, which was in 2014 or so, when we got that 71% good versus bad, that ICU practices may have become more uniform, and so we weren't actually seeing much more variation in ICU practice from one 6-month period to another 6-month period. And back in 2013, 2014, there was actually more sort of 6-month to 6-month period variation. There are a number of reasons there, and the peptic investigators were very excited, and sort of the ICU investigators were very excited to say, well, maybe this is our golden ticket to conducting large trials in intensive care. But there was an element of luck involved, and I'm interested to see from the Australian New Zealand database going forward, redoing those types of good-bad correlations to see if they persist in the current landscape environment in ICU. And fortunately in ICU, we were lucky with the peptic trial. The peptic trial finished prior to the COVID era, and that could have really caused mayhem with that, and it could cause regional differences in COVID presentations in ICU could really cause mayhem towards calculating these good and bad correlations where the patterns of presentations differ across ICUs with in different regions.
Yes, I mean, we're sort of running slowly over time. Perhaps we should finish off on the one last question from Chris Levy, and the question is for both Chris and Stephen. And the question is: the move to EMR and the view for states that EMR may become the spine for SQRs raises challenges. Any comments and ways forward? Stephen?
I'm skeptical that I will see it, and I've got 14 years before I retire. I outlined some of the reasons for that skepticism, and the other really pragmatic one is just the sheer difficulty jurisdictions seem to experience with sharing data and pooling data, and even if you had data items, be they process or outcomes, that were reliably and accurately collected by administrative data sets consistently across every hospital, across every jurisdiction, the idea that the jurisdictions would then feed their data into some central area for analysis in a CQR or other, I think that's years and years and years away. Am I being unduly cynical when I look at the process it's taken to simply pool our national hospital separations data set and actually get that linked together? I don't think that's cynical. I think that's realistic.
And Chris, what are your views?
Thanks, Chris, for the question. And yeah, it's challenging. I guess I'm probably a little bit more, maybe a little bit more optimistic. I think if there's opportunities for demonstrations, and I'll give you the example, in Western Australia, we're now, trying to build a West Australian cardiac outcomes registry, so it will fit in with the national model. But the fact that we're starting now, we're actually looking at the routinely collected data through a data system which is consistent across at least the 3 or 4 major hospitals which do PCI in the state, and looking at extracting that information out to fill the minimal data data required for the National Cardiac Registry. And as it works out, what is collected across all of those sites covers about, actually about 60% of what's needed. So with really good coordination and planning, you could see how we might move to a point where, with modifications of standard platforms in hospital systems and good information on what's the key data you may actually move towards that. But I agree with Stephen that it's going to be a long process. Stephen, I retire a lot longer before, a lot earlier before you do. I've only got about 3 or 4 years yet, so I don't think I'll see it in my time.
I'd just perhaps add, Dorota, that one of the areas, and Patty picked this up, one of the areas where EMRs do greatly lend themselves, particularly if you can link together primary care and hospital-based care, is in health services research and looking at access to services and I've got an interest in issues around cultural bias, and there's really no other way to accurately get at least that sort of data, and that's a situation where, if you like, that data is the gold standard.
Okay. Well, I suppose, Felicity, would you like to add final comments? Because this is the data.
No, I think it's I'm happy to leave it at that, and it's probably time to wrap up.